I learned this from a wonderful writer named Mike Langford. I asked him, what makes your book so great? But he said, one piece of advice is, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, whatever you think the reader needs to know, wait until the last possible minute to tell. And as soon as he said it, it clicked. If I tell the reader something before they need to know it, they don't care. And the same goes in a classroom. You're talking along as a professor or as a fellow student. You're talking about something. If other people are thinking, well, gee, why is that so? Or wait a minute, that doesn't make, I don't understand this. Who is that person? What's going on? Now they're motivated to hear the answer because they formulated the question themselves. And they may have some hypotheses of their own about what the answer is going to be. And then you give them the answer and it's really rewarding. That's the secret of good teaching.
Dan, thanks for joining. Really excited to have you. It was actually pretty funny timing. I had just seen a LinkedIn, I think, post about your new book coming out. I heard there was a secret chord. And coincidentally, your former colleague, my current co-founder, Ari, flash it to us a little bit. Great.
Shameless plug.
I love that. Tell us a little bit more about it, actually. Go ahead. What is it about?
Oh, well, this is really a culmination of my 30 years of work on music and the brain and understanding how music can impact health, psychological health, physical health, pain management, how it can be used to treat disease. And it comes out of some wonderful experiences I had working with the National Institutes of Health, the AARP, Global Council on Brain Health, and just being part of a community of about 400 researchers in the neuroscience of music area to bring to the public what we know about how music can help us to not only cure diseases and injury, but help us to lead more productive lives.
How did you get into the intersection of music and health and brain?
Well, the music and brain part came first because I got my PhD in neuroscience, and my doctoral advisor, Mike Posner, who was one of the first people to do a neuroimaging brain scan, said that he thought that the field of music and brain didn't really exist yet as we know it. And he thought that because I had been a professional musician and record producer for many years, that I might bring to that field something unique and that I might be able to actually get a job. He was thinking, there are all kinds of cognitive neuroscientists being minted every year with PhDs. How do you distinguish yourself? And he thought, well, this would be a niche. And I thought, well, that's great. I can merge two of my passions, music and neuroscience. And then the health part came later because about 10 years ago, Francis Collins, who's currently working in the White House Science Office, but at the time was the head of the NIH, Francis convened a bunch of us together to see if there really was any evidence for music as medicine. 10 years ago, there were a lot of stories, but the plural of anecdote is not data. And so he wanted to know if all those stories had been tested empirically, about people with Alzheimer's suddenly coming out of a catatonic state or something. Was there anything real to this? And so that launched me on the music and health adventure.
Wow. There actually, this reminds me of things that I've always wondered about, and which is, I find it really striking that we as humans have this natural sense of beauty, and both visually, but also through music and sound. And we all have a similar sense of what is a melodic, kind of a major chord, minor chord, what sounds sad, what sounds happy. And just that seemed like an unintuitive evolutionary pressure that we would develop this as a species. Curious, actually, your thoughts on why our brains are wired to respond to music like this.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Vince, the evolutionary basis of music. And I I wrote a book about 15 years ago called This Is Your Brain on Music, and the last chapter of that book grapples with the question. And now, 20 years later, I'm taking it up again. And so your intuitions, some of your intuitions are right, and those are that there are some intrinsic properties of music that we encode without any training or thought. So, in general, very deep bass, loud, deep, low bass can symbol something threatening, because evolutionarily that would be the hoofbeats of an elephant, or some heavy animal coming towards you, or thunder, or an avalanche. And so in horror movies or adventure movies, when your seat shakes in that Dolby THX experience, that's what they're exploiting. And slower music tends to indicate sadness, or at the very least self-reflection. Dissonance tends to indicate something stressful. Consonance, something serene. So we all know this wonderful piece by Grieg. If we don't know it by name, we know da 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 da
Yes.
da 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 da.
Yeah.
There's this sort of pastoral scene. You notice that the notes are sort of stepwise. There aren't any great leaps. It's kind of slow. Da 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 da. Stepwise motion, not these gigantic intervals. And so that indicates serenity and peace, more or less intrinsically. But then there are other things, like you mentioned major and minor. Those are cultural, and we learn those. We learn that minor tends to be sad in our culture, and that major tends to be happy. We learn that certain instruments are associated with certain actions or emotions. And we've done these experiments where we've gone into other cultures with Western music, cultures that have not been exposed to Western music, and they don't make the same major minor associations that we do. And for anybody of my generation anyway, when you hear a staccato xylophone going up the scale, like doot, 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 you picture Bugs Bunny tiptoeing up the stairs, or some kind of an upward motion. But the whole idea of up and down, I just said going up. Doot, 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 doot. That's intuitive to us, but only by culture. The Greeks would have called that going down, because to them the high notes are what we call the high notes. They considered the low notes, because the strings, if they were arranged vertically, were shorter and therefore closer to the ground.
Oh, interesting. Okay, got it. So there's definitely things that it seems like that I think are more intrinsic are actually learned kind of behaviors, or the kind of trained associations, it seems like. I guess I have a question, maybe segueing more broadly into what got you into neuroscience and the study of the brain. Like, how did you get interested in that and decided that this is a field you want to really dedicate your life's work to?
I took a class in my freshman year at MIT that was taught by Susan Carey and Merrill Garrett. And it was called Cognitive Psychology. This was 1975. And there was no textbook then, and cognitive psychology wasn't really a known thing. But I remember I kept my lecture notes even, and I look back at them now and then. I remember that they presented it to us as a class where we're going to think about thinking. What does it mean to think? What does it mean to have ideas? And where do they come from? And in those days, you didn't really study the human brain. You studied the mind, a collection of thought processes, where I think of the mind as the software and the brain as the biological hardware. And we didn't have the tools to study the brain other than to perform surgeries on people. So, which is frowned upon if you're running a lab and you want to study the brain. Can't just bring in a bunch of undergraduates and run surgery on them. So Um,
Fair.
Now we've got brain scanning techniques, and my own lab does we do neurochemical work where we give somebody a pill that innocuously blocks some neurotransmitter for a short period of time, or various things like that. But in those days, it was what is thought? What is the nature of thought? How do we learn? How do we remember? And I just that seemed fascinating to me, and at the same time, music seemed fascinating to me. And so I dropped out of college after my sophomore year to play in bands, but I kept up with all of the literature, and I sat in on classes now and then on cognitive psychology. And so when the music business started to implode in 1990, having been dropped out for a decade and a half, I decided not to leave music behind, but to have a backup plan for a job.
Yeah.
And so I figured I should at least finish my bachelor's degree. And at that time, it was just the beginnings of cognitive neuroscience. So cognitive psychology merged with brain sciences. In fact, MIT's department changed its name to the Department of Brain Sciences somewhere there. And the idea of trying to figure out what's going on up here and how it influences the way we see the world and the way we are and the way we interact with the world, the way we gain knowledge, the way we interact with each other. That goes back to, of course, to Aristotle, and it was the province of philosophers for thousands of years. It was only in our lifetime that it became the province of experimentalists. And so I just thought, the great thing about that field is you can do almost anything. There's this wonderful scene in The Big Bang Theory, a TV show, and the scene was written by my friend Eric Kaplan. And for those of our listeners who don't know the series, it follows some Caltech professors and their friends. And one of them, Sheldon Cooper, is a theoretical physicist. And his girlfriend, Amy Farrah Fowler, played by Mayim Bialik, is a neurobiologist. And they're dating, and I said that she's his girlfriend, they're dating. They get into a fight about whose work is more important. And it's a wonderful scene because Sheldon says, how can you possibly think that your work, I don't remember the exact dialogue, but your work about the human brain could possibly be as important as my work as a theoretical physicist. I'm going to unlock the secrets of the universe and the origins of the universe and the origins of mankind and how brains came into being. How could your work possibly be more important? It just seems cute and quaint. And she says, but as a neurobiologist studying the mind, I can figure out how it is that you came to your conclusions. And so ipso facto, my field subsumes yours under its own paradigm.
I like
so,
that. Yeah.
That's why I'm fascinated by it.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a philosopher in you as well.
Well, you're right, because to me, cognitive neuroscience is empirical philosophy. We're taking the questions that go back 2,000 years and bringing them into a laboratory. And indeed, one of my most influential colleagues, who just passed away recently, was not a neuroscientist, but a philosopher, Dan Dennett. And when Dan Dennett and I would get together, his knowledge of cognitive neuroscience vastly exceeded that of me or anyone else I know in the field, because he's not running experiments. He has time to read what we do and to tell us what we're missing and to tell us what the next important step would be.
Interesting. I want to make an assertion. It's something that I think I believe, but then I would love to hear, is it true? Does it have an ounce of truth? Like what is actually scientifically proven? So the assertions I would make is people don't naturally want to learn. And what I mean by that is, when given the choice, like an average adult, let's say, they're not gonna an average person doesn't naturally want to go spend the extra time, the leisure time have on learning. They do other things. And that you actually have to create very intentionally conditions that incentivize and motivate people to spend that time on learning instead of something else that maybe gives more instant gratification. Let me pause. What is your reaction to that assertion, and what would science say about how humans get motivated to learn and how they engage?
Well, I'm really glad we landed here, Vince, because of course you and I met through Ari, and Ari and I have dedicated a great chunk of our lives to trying to improve learning and the science of learning. And I think the question about intrinsic motivation to learn is fundamental here. So to begin answering the question, I'd say there are vast individual differences. All of us on the planet differ from one another, and we differ from anybody who ever lived. And we differ from one another on thousands of different features and factors and attributes. And one of them is curiosity. It's a fundamental way we differ from one another. And curiosity is not a unidimensional continuum. You can't just say that somebody has more or less of it, and that's the end of the story. It actually exists in several dimensions. There are different kinds of curiosity. There are different motivators for it. Some people are curious just because they have a fear of looking stupid. They don't really care what the answer is, or they don't really care. They just want to not look stupid in front of other people.
So it's a social pressure, that kind of.
Exactly. Yes. Other people are curious in order to solve a problem right in front of them, a very pragmatic curiosity. And then, so if I were to ask you all the different ways that you might solve the problem of the weight of the Empire State Building, you might say, well, I would just go on the website and find out what the weight is. Or, I'd ask somebody who works there, I'd go down, I'd find the superintendent of the building, and I'd say, or whatever. But a kind of loftier curiosity is the one where, gee, that's an interesting problem. I'll bet there are half a dozen different ways of figuring that out. And I'd like to explore those just for their own sake. Now, I'm not saying one kind of curiosity is better than another necessarily, or that there's a hierarchy of them, even though I said this was a lofty one. The difference in motivation for being curious and learning things is different across people, it's different across the lifespan, and it's different in different contexts. The most curious people I know don't want to know about absolutely everything all the way to a ridiculous end, because they wouldn't have time for anything else. So there is a practical component to all of it. But winding the clock back, most kids start out very curious. We talk about the terrible twos. We talk about the exploratory 3 and 4-year-olds. There's this, 2, 3, and 4-year-olds. They're opening cabinets. They're pulling stuff out. They're putting stuff in their mouth. An inordinate number of young toddlers die of poisoning every year because they swallowed something they shouldn't have, or they choke on a coin or something. That's curiosity. It's a desire, and by curiosity I mean a desire to learn. It's unfortunately a maladaptive and misguided desire in some cases. And anybody who's had kids know that most of them go through a period of asking why, endlessly. It's bedtime. Why? You need your sleep. Why? So you won't be tired tomorrow. Why? So you can do well in preschool. Why? Well, so that you can, learn stuff. Why? Well, so that you can get into college. Why? Well, so that you can get a better job. Why? It goes on and on and on, and it never ends. And that's a very natural thing. Some kids keep it, and they tend to become artists and scientists and or just very happy people and engaged people. Some people have it beaten out of them by impatient teachers and parents who tell them just to shut up, kid, you bother me. That's sort of it in a nutshell.
Interesting. So seems like there is a very big innate kind of characteristics around curiosity, as well as some of the conditions that can, either amplify or diminish someone's level of curiosity. In your experience, because you've taught and led learning in different environments, you're a professor at McGill, you've helped build Minerva, you've written books, you've given lectures. What are your perspectives on learning environments that tend to be effective kind of in getting people to learn, like more number of people? Any principles you have?
Well, I think the most powerful principle is that anyone is more likely to learn through experience and through figuring it out for themselves than by just being told something. You have to want to know something first. And so you have to be motivated to want to know. And then if whatever it is you're learning, whether it's science or arts or some practical skill like how to mount something in drywall so that it doesn't fall off, mount some heavy object in drywall, or mount it in brick so the brick doesn't completely splinter, or just social interactions. First has to come the motivation to do it and do it well, learn it well. And then having some experiential interaction with your body, with your hands, with to the extent possible, or experiential, at least in your mind, as a thought experiment. So what we try to do at Minerva is this flipped classroom idea where professors don't actually teach anything in broad strokes. We say, this is what we're going to be talking about in the next seminar. You need to learn enough about it that you can talk about it. And if there are two sides to an issue, you need to learn both sides so that if we have a debate, you can instantaneously be assigned one side or the other and then switch sides. You have to know enough about the facets of a problem to be able to talk about all of them. And you have to teach yourself what you need to know and then apply it in a real world classroom, at least classroom situation. Applying the knowledge as you learn it is the way to get it to stick. So if it's, a science or math class is the easiest, you want to find the volume of a weirdly shaped object. And you can learn all the equations and techniques in the world, but until you start doing it and do it over and over again, you don't really learn it. One of the principles I learned in writing my books was, I learned this from a wonderful writer named Mike Langford. He's written 2 books in his life, and they're both superb. One is called Becoming Leonardo, which is about Leonardo da Vinci. And the other is Life in Double Time, which is his memoir as life as a drummer in a touring band. And they're exquisite. And I asked him, I couldn't figure it out. I asked him, what makes your books so great? And he said, well, I don't know what they're great, but he said, my one piece of advice is, whatever it is whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, whatever you think the reader needs to know, wait until the last possible minute to tell them. And as soon as he said it, it clicked. If I tell the reader something before they need to know it, they don't care. But if they're reading along, and the same goes in a classroom, you're talking along as a professor or as a fellow student, you're talking about something. And if the other people in the room, or in a book, the case of a reader, or in the case of a movie, the audience, if other people are thinking, well, gee, why is that so? Or wait a minute, that doesn't make, I don't understand this. Who is that person? And how did they come? What's going on? Now they're motivated to hear the answer because they formulated the question themselves. And they may have some hypotheses of their own about what the answer is going to be. And then you give them the answer, and it's really rewarding. That's the secret of good teaching. lead them there, but hold back the answer until the last possible minute. So when I taught at McGill and I had 700 students, I treated it as though I had 30. I would ask a question. I would call on people, cold call, give me the answer, give me the answer. And then cold call on someone else. What do you think of that answer? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Does that make sense? Why do you agree? Why do you disagree? I suspended the actual answer for as long as possible.
This really resonates also because actually one of the most popular activity sequence that on our learning platform is where people first work on something and compare the answers only after it's shown the expert perspective and kind of the aha looking at it. Either because, oh, we got these right and our intuition is correct, or, oh, we missed that, but that's interesting. I think those aha moments really seem to get things to stick. So I think what you're saying really resonates, although I don't think I had quite crystallized like the impact of asking the question, suspending it, and then, almost like leading them to the answer and then dropping the answer like the spark was the thing that gets things to stick.
It's a lot like jokes.
It's true. That's great. That's true.
Right? I mean, for a joke to be effective, you have to be thinking of what the punchline will be, and you have to be wrong. If you see it coming, you're just mad.
That's true. That's true.
But if of all the possibilities you can come up with, the joke teller comes up with something different, you go, aha. And that's the spark of learning. That's, I thought the road was going here. And look at that. The road actually ended up over there. Isn't that interesting?
I really like this analogy of learning and a great learning having a similar experience and structure of a great joke.
Yeah.
Really
It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. And it's the same thing in music. Sure. If you hear exactly where the composer is going, you're just mad.
Yeah.
But if they can surprise you and come up with something you didn't imagine, then they've won you over.
Interesting. I'm curious, I guess building on the theme of the science of learning, when you look at the latest neuroscience research today, have there been breakthroughs recently that really change our view of how humans learn and build skills? And I ask this question in context of pretty big shifts happening in the world where upskilling, reskilling is, a big challenge. And I think people really struggle with, do we have the means and the tools and the ability to actually really elevate skills at scale? I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that from, the science of learning angle.
Well, I think one big development applies to more to procedural learning than to other kinds of learning. So by procedural learning, I mean something that you do with your hands, playing a musical instrument, learning to balance on a tightrope, learning to ride a unicycle, learning to do woodwork or joinery, Japanese joinery where there's no nails and everything just fits together. I mean, there's an infinite number of procedural kinds of things. But with procedural learning, what we've come to learn through neuroscience just recently has to do with sleep and dreams. And that is that the function of sleep and dreams is to encode in your memory, your long-term memory, the events of the previous day. And there's a particular chemical called acetylcholine that is released when you sleep that helps to facilitate this process. And as you're sleeping and you go through the stages of sleep, your brain is sort of doing a download, a core dump of all the different things that happened during the day and trying to relate them or link them to previous experiences that you had that are similar. even ones that are not obviously linked, not maybe linked in some nonlinear or only metaphorical way. And then store them in long-term memory so that you can retrieve them later. And what this has to do with procedural learning, easiest way to describe it is if you're trying to learn something on a musical instrument. If you practice it right before you go to bed, even if it's only 5 minutes, you got some passage you're trying to learn. You spend 5 minutes on it before you go to bed. That'll give it a privileged position in your sleep and dream cycle. Then when you wake up in the morning, before you do anything else, practice it again and instantiate what your sleep learning taught you. And do that every day. Again, even if it's only 5 or 10 minutes, bookending the day. You make tremendous progress on the project via this process. And the reason is that you are consolidating and reinstantiating the information. Every time you pull something out of memory, it gets changed a little bit, and then you put it back. And so this process reinforces itself. It works also with non-procedural learning. So like if you're trying to memorize calculus and physics formulas or the Krebs cycle in biology, or, if you're trying to memorize a script, you're an actor, or you're trying to write a poem, whatever it is you're doing, if you bookend your day with it, it allows your subconscious to run with it.
You're changing how I might want to approach my basketball drills. Seems like I should do it at night, in the morning. Interesting.
And basketball is a special case because you probably don't have a basketball court in your living room.
Right. But if it's nearby, maybe you go at night and then you do it in the morning. Yeah, but you're right. Like,
I mean, if you're brawny, maybe you've got one in your house. But
yeah.
or shack. But apart from that, you can visualize it though. Right before you go to sleep, visualize the layups, visualize the shot, the free throw, and play in your memory motor movements that you did to get there. That's helpful.
Interesting. Why do you think? I guess maybe it's because it's hard to insert this kind of habits into someone's life, because nighttime and morning time is generally quite private and personal. But it seems like there's an opportunity for this principle to be more used by education and learning and training providers who really need to make skills stick for the people that they're trying to educate.
Well, if it were me, I would design an education app that selects the most important thing for that day or that week. And I would have it, come up on your smartphone. Your smartphone already knows pretty much when you usually go to sleep and when you close the phone. My phone started telling me, oh, you usually open these apps when you first wake up in the morning, like the weather app and the New York Times app or the Wall Street Journal app or whatever it is. It tells me these are the apps you usually open. So it knows. So it could be telling you, all right, you're about to go to sleep. Spend 5 minutes on this lesson. And then when you wake up, hey, spend 5 minutes on this before you shower and brush your teeth. I would make an app that did that and integrate it with the clock and all the other stuff.
Okay, well, somebody now might make it after hearing this insight. We've talked a little bit about timing as being an important part of accelerating learning. What about, and you also talked about experience being a really important driver.
Timing, and timing's important. Ask me, what is the most important thing in comedy?
What is the most important thing in comedy?
Timing.
Interesting. So it still persists the analogy and the thread of comedy and learning being a very well linked phenomenon. What about the way you actually engage? Is there some way of engaging with the material or the skill that really enhances the efficiency of learning?
Well, the engagement usually has to be goal driven. So I started out as a math major and I loved math. And at MIT, you could choose between theoretical math and applied math. And I kind of regret not choosing theoretical math because that is an end in itself and a discipline. But I also found that I had more difficulty learning theoretical math. I just didn't have the brain or the background or experience or proclivity for it. But applied math, here was an actual problem that I had to solve. And so, not again, it's coming back to individual differences, Vince, but for some people having some goal, I'm doing this because. So, the classic cases in our time is software. I find the user interface for Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator to be atrocious. And I worked in a user interface lab for 2 years as a postdoc for a Paul Allen company. And I learned about and tried to implement human experience, UI stuff, from a cognitive psychology background. And our ethos was if you need an instruction manual, the device has already been poorly designed. It's too late. And whether you're talking about a physical device like a microwave oven or your car, or whether you're talking about software, you should not need an instruction manual. This comes out of the wonderful work by Don Norman and his influential book in the 90s called The Psychology of Everyday Things. It's also titled The Psychopathology of Everyday Things. And his great example was doors in public spaces. So if you see a door with a handle on it, like one of these loopy handles, you know you're not supposed to push it. It's what's called a Gibsonian affordance after the great cognitive psychologist J.J. Gibson. It tells you you're supposed to wrap your hand around it and pull. And if it's got one of these flat metal plates, it tells you you're supposed to push. But of course, designers don't always adhere to that. And Norman has all these examples in public buildings of like doors with the pull handle that says, and then somebody had to tape up a sign that says push because they put the hinges on wrong or something like that. But the idea that you should be able to figure it out without a manual is fundamental. But the problem is that engineers often design these things without consultation with psychologists because engineers think they're smarter than everybody else in the room because they know more math. And you end up you end up with these things that are impossible to use. So I'm not stupid. And I taught computer science at Stanford for a while in the user interface group. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I'm not stupid. But I find Photoshop and Illustrator impenetrable. And I find the manual impenetrable. But I can do some things on it because they're goal driven. I needed to do something. I needed to up-res some files. I needed to do some copy and paste stuff and get rid of backgrounds. And so kicking and screaming, I learned to do it. But that was because I had a goal. I had to accomplish something. By the way, I'll put in a plug for a Mac program called Graphic Converter, which is free, and it does almost everything that Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator do, and I don't need the manual.
Okay, I'll check it out. It's actually what you're saying triggers an idea that's a little bit tangential, but I'm very curious. The idea that if you want to really learn and improve, it has to be effortful. Like if it was too easy, you wouldn't necessarily learn. And actually, the question I want to ask is more related to what's happening now, right? Which is we can't escape AI at this point. Like people are talking about it all the time. And the interface is getting easier and easier to use. And on one hand, it's very exciting. On the other hand, I have a bit of a concern of we're going to turn into what we look like on the road with GPS, meaning we can't really handle GPS and find directions. And so there's a little bit of concern around, do we become so dependent on these tools that we stop using our brain? I'm curious how you think about what's going on now and how you think human mind and as a species will respond to it.
Well, I think in one respect, we can talk about AI as a separate issue, but in one respect, it's an extension of being able to Google anything or Bing anything. Or Google is a generic word like Kleenex, the brand name that stands for a whole bunch of right. I can look anything up, and so it's effortless. And I think it causes all of us to value the information less. And so with the lessening of its value come two things. One is we're less likely to retain the information because we don't have to. And the other is it follows from that, because we're not retaining it, we don't make any effort to link it to other concepts that we know. And all great inventions and great discoveries, I would argue, come from being able to link things that had been previously unlinked, to see connections between things that we hadn't seen before, to find an analogy or a structure that had eluded everyone else. And getting back to jokes, that's what a great joke is. A great joke is something where you go, wow, why didn't I think of that? That's so obvious.
Surprising linkage, yeah.
A friend of mine the other day said, what's the circumference of the Earth? And boy, I used to know that. I used to have a lot of facts in my head, but I haven't thought about it in a long time. I haven't used it. And she said, well, I'll just Google it. And I said, well, no, wait, don't do that. Let's see if we can figure this out. I know that there are 24 hours in a day. And I know that it takes the Earth 24 hours to spin around. And I think that there are 24 time zones in the Earth. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but I seem to recall that there are. And it seems to me that time zones are about 1,000 miles apart, based on my experience. And so maybe the circumference of the Earth is about 24,000 miles. Well, it turns out that's pretty darn close. So now, look what we've done. We've made a link between this knowledge of the circumference of the Earth and the Earth's period of rotation and geographical time zones and travel and distance. And this is very satisfying. Now, I don't know that alone is going to solve any problem or lead to any new invention, but that kind of thinking is, right? We get back to the weight of the Empire State Building, which is a question that Google used to ask of prospective employees, not because they cared about the answer, but because they cared about the experiment of how would you figure it out? How do you think? How do you approach problems? And the reason Google used to do this, and other big companies like Tesla or Apple, is because when they're hiring somebody today in 2024, they have no idea what's going to be required of that person in 2034. Not a clue. The business is changing so fast. So they can't hire you based on what you know. They're not going to just hire a bunch of people who happen to know the circumference of the Earth. That does them no good.
Yeah.
Or who can name all the elements in the periodic table in order and their atomic weights. That doesn't do any good. They need somebody who can think creatively and who has an intrinsic desire to learn new things and apply that learning in new situations. So how would you figure out the way to the Empire State Building? Well, yeah, you could go to the website, but no, that doesn't count. And there are a bunch of ways to answer it, but well, okay, it's roughly a city block wide maybe, and half a city block long, and I don't know, it's 100 stories, and it's made out of steel and concrete, but it's mostly air. And one of my favorite solutions to the problem is, well, knowing basically its dimensions and that's made out of steel and air. What's a common thing I know? Well, cars. Cars are made out of steel and air. The average car is, I don't know, a ton. I'm looking for an order of magnitude estimate where I don't want to be off by a factor of 10. So how many cars could I stuff into one floor of the Empire State Building? And there's 100 floors. And, you can come to a reasonable answer that way.
Right.
That kind of combines all the things we're talking about. It combines curiosity. It combines a goal-oriented thinking. It combines making links between things you wouldn't otherwise link.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's the kind of critical thinking where the thing that you're doing is not information retrieval, but actually combining different things to create a solution seems like the kind of skill that we need to be able to do as humans. Maybe one last question for you. Especially in corporate learning, where you're trying to train professionals who are pretty busy, they have a lot of things going on. Designing and delivering an effective program is pretty difficult. It's a challenge that a lot of companies grapple with. Knowing everything you know about how people learn, how people engage, what's one piece of advice or suggestion you would have to really elevate learning in the workplace?
Well, corporate learning is tricky. I taught for a few years at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley in the executive education program, where we would either bring in C-suite people or more rank and file managers for a 3-day intensive course. And it was almost everybody already had an MBA and of course. And the question was, how do you get them motivated to learn new things? Because business people, corporate people tend to be very practical. What's the bottom line? How's this going to help me increase profits or, increase revenues or reduce expenses, either which will help you increase profits, or how does this increase innovation, which could increase profits or shareholder value? So that's a really tough one. I think ultimately, the long-term strategy is you hire people who are lifelong learners. It comes from HR. The HR department has to hire people who are lifelong learners, who are intrinsically motivated, and getting back to what we started the hour with, who are curious, who have an abiding, I would say, personality of being curious. Once you have that, almost everything else falls out.
That kind of solves by itself. The hardest problem anyway.
Yeah. Failing that, pardon me, trying to motivate people who are not curious to exercise their curiosity. And one way that is effective, although it seems a little silly and a little bit 80s, perhaps, maybe a little bit too Northern California, is to unlock their creativity by some sort of art project, right? Have them write a collaborative song together or make a mural together or something that will seem silly to them, but will sort of get the juices flowing about being creative, open up another side of their mind. And then a third thing really is just to try and instill in them the value of approaching problems from different angles. And so one way I do that is by, these sort of Harvard Business School case studies and Minerva case studies about what are some of the great discoveries in science and how did they come to creative problem solving. And gee, you could be one of those people too. And my favorite example of that has to do with one of the, if you'll allow me a digression, I find this to be very motivating for people in the corporate world, this story. If you have cancer, particularly a cancer, not a skin cancer that's relatively easily operatable, but a brain cancer, prostate cancer, or breast cancer, how do you treat it? And surgery is one way. It's invasive. It It's not always possible if you've got metastasis. And radiation therapy is one means. And the problem with radiation is that it burns the skin and it damages the skin on the way in. So suppose you've got this tumor embedded in the body somewhere and you want to blast it with radiation. How do you avoid damaging the skin where the beam goes? And the person who invented this new technique, which is called stereotactic radiation beam therapy, SRBT, was a student of history and a student of military history in particular. And so how do you attack a fortified city? If you put all your troops in one place, the enemy will repel them because the enemy has all the power to do that.
Full force there, yeah.
But what if you attack the city from 10 different directions at once, right? There have been several battles that have been won that way where, the enemy expected you to come from one place, and by the time they scatter their forces, you're coming in from all these different directions. And so the idea of this radiation therapy is no single beam is concentrated to a sufficient degree that it will damage the skin or the surrounding tissue on the way in, but they focus on a single point and they can obliterate the cancer without causing collateral damage. What a story of thinking, a way that brings in knowledge from a completely different domain to the domain at hand.
So inspiring the cross-disciplinary impact maybe is another way to inspire them.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Dan, this was really wonderful. Great to meet you finally. I've heard so many good things about you through Ari. And it was an exploration of the mind, the music, neuroscience for corporate learning and other areas. So it was really great. I've learned a lot from this talking to you. And I hope your new book really thrives as well.
Thank you for having me, Vince.
Awesome.